All right, so let's just move on. We'll talk first, of course, about Standard 5 and then do Standard 6, and then, as luck would have it, we'll finish up with Standard 7. So Standard 5, remember I said that I thought Standard 3 was the most important. I think Standard 5 is probably comes next in terms of testable material that, easy to write test questions on, all that sort of stuff. So again, 3, 4, and 5 really, but 3 is number 1 in my book, and then 4 and 5 would be something worth spending some extra time on. So here we're talking about investment analysis, recommendations, and actions. And what you're going to see at the outset here is the second pillar of Andy's an assessment of what's going on in the ethics material. So it's independence, loyalty, diligence, reasonable basis, suitability, and then my caveat is disclosure, which we'll talk about in the next standard. So here, diligence and reasonable basis, what are we learning here? Well, we are required, not because we want to be necessarily great economists or great investors or whatever that happens to be, although we certainly want that, but as an ethical proposition, we also have to be diligent. So diligence, independence, thoroughness when we are analyzing investments and making investment recommendations and taking action. So this is going to involve, I think, a relatively high standard for what constitutes diligence and thoroughness on the exam. So if you can think of this as the no stone left unturned principle, meaning that if someone is recommending a particular asset for inclusion in a portfolio, they have to understand that asset and its risk and return parameters very well. That means that they have to have been very diligent in their investigation of that asset. So if you come across a scenario on the exam where someone is looking at this asset and they're thinking that maybe this would be important, but they decide that because they're pressed for time or something else, then they're not going to go to the full length or use a full measure of diligence, then they are going to be in violation of the Standard 5A. So we've got to be diligent, thorough. We have to have a reasonable and adequate basis for all of our recommendations. Got to be supported by research, those types of things. That's what we're saying here. And again, I would count on applying a very high standard to this on the exam. So if someone is being lazy, someone is trying to not do something because it's going to be hard to do or it's going to be time consuming or they're under time pressure, then you are looking at a violation of this. So the assumption underlying this for exam purposes is that everyone has plenty of time to be diligent and thorough in all of their analyses. So looking at some guidance here, make reasonable effort to cover all, there's that word again, relevant issues when arriving at an investment recommendation. The level of diligence will depend on the product or service offered. This is part of the ethics material. My advice is that you not let this lull you into a false sense of security about some type of shirking that can go on the exam. So there is the notion of limited service that is codified in the ethics material, but I don't think it's something that you ought to consider at the forefront of your analysis when it comes to diligence and reasonable basis. So remember, think about a high standard here. Continuing on with some more guidance, so what about using secondary or third-party research? Well, again, just like we've discussed this previously when we were talking about plagiarism, it's fine to use someone else's research as long as you give it proper attribution. So that circumvents the plagiarism problems. Okay, but we are also, if we're going to use third-party research, we are also responsible for investigating the soundness of that research. So we have to go back and review assumptions. How rigorous was it? How timely is it? And was the analyst that conducted the research independent in their investigation? If they weren't, then those will certainly be things that have to be considered when we employ this third-party researcher's conclusions in our assessment of the asset. So we need to encourage the firm to adopt a policy of periodic review of the quality of third-party research, again regarding the assumptions and timeliness and rigor and objectivity and all those types of things. So if we are using someone else's research, maybe we're using research that we're given in terms of soft dollars, comes from some other place, something that a broker is giving us, well, we need some sort of policy about a periodic review of the quality of that research in order to really be able to use that and be in compliance with our diligence and reasonable basis requirements. What about recommended procedures? go. Sorry, recommended procedures. We need to establish a policy that research and recommendations should have a reasonable and adequate basis. Well, that makes good sense. So we don't want to be putting out there something that's just hearsay or something we got off a Ouija board, right? So that ought to be a policy of the firm. We need to review or approve research reports and recommendations prior to external circulation. So this, again, it comes under the heading of recommended. I would put this under the strongly recommended category, though. So we have to have some sort of review process prior to external distribution. And, of course, the point there is it's a lot easier to correct something than it is to take it back. So we can correct it if it hasn't been distributed, but if it has been distributed, then we are going to have to take it back, and that's going to be a lot more difficult. Continuing on with our recommended procedures here, we need to establish due diligence procedures for judging if recommendations have met reasonable and adequate basis criteria. Once again, we are not told what those due diligence procedures are in the ethics material, but there ought to be some way of doing that. And again, we get at this idea that we are supposed to develop measurable criteria for assessing the quality of research. Maybe that's going to be something that has to do with judging the performance of analysts over time, those types of things. But we're not told, and we shouldn't be expected to comment on initially a measurability criteria as long as it is economically sound and it is a systematic policy and it doesn't do something. It's not something that just covers one day. It needs to be some sort of longer term view, and then we will have a better view of what is measurable in terms of, or acceptable for measurable criteria under the ethics material. Okay, so some more recommended procedures here. We need to consider scenarios outside recent experience to assess the downside risk of quantitative models. Now again, this is the material that you're using here comes out of the 2010 ethics material, which is the book that you're responsible for this year. So those books have fairly long cycles. But nonetheless, remember that 2010 is not long after 2008, right? So we had all this financial meltdown, and part of the problem associated with that was we were looking at experience as a guide to the scenarios that we should use to stress test cash flows and those types of things. So what we ended up with in 2008 were scenarios in terms of things like default rates that were far outside what we had seen in recent experience. This is an advocation that we are supposed to consider something other than what is actually experiential. So we need to think about, well, how big can default rates be, not just what have we observed over the last 5 or 10 or even 20 years. So, and it's not just good economics. It is good economics, by the way, but it's not just good economics. Here, it also rises to the level of an ethical responsibility. We need to make sure the firm has procedures to evaluate external advisors. Okay, so if we're going to promote them, including how often we need to go out and make those evaluations. Looking at some more, finishing up these recommended procedures, we need written procedures of acceptable scenario testing, range of scenarios, cash flow sensitivity to assumptions and inputs, all those types of things. So we need some way to describe how rigorous our scenario testing is going to be. So this is related back to what we talked about just a few minutes ago. Again, good economics, and I guess before I read the 2010 book, I didn't realize that rose to the level of an ethical responsibility. But if you look at the pain and suffering that was caused worldwide as a result of the meltdown back in 2008, then you think, yeah, maybe we do have responsibilities there, and that this does make sense. We need procedures for evaluating outside information providers. So if we're getting information from outside providers, we need to think about how we're going to evaluate the quality of that, and how often we're going to go through and evaluate the quality. Lastly, and I think this is a relatively important point, there's no need to dissociate from group research that the member doesn't agree with. Now, we need to think back and remember that we're working with diligence and reasonable basis. So if you're part of a group research, so you're a group that's about to put out a research asset recommendation, a buy or a sell or something like that, well, if you have a group of 5 people that's putting that together and you are a dissenting view, meaning that the other 4 think it's a buy, you think it's a sell, well, they are diametrically opposed to you. They all think it's a good buy, you think it is a sell. Okay? Is there an ethical need there for you to dissociate from that group? Well, no, there's not, as long as the majority has a reasonable basis supported by research for their conclusions. So they're not just saying, well, we all agree that it's a sell, but we're going to issue a buy anyway because it's going to be good for investment banking business. Well, that would not be an acceptable scenario. But as long as the majority has this reasonable basis, then there's no need to dissociate from that. There's always going to be dissenting opinions, is the point. All right, so let's move on now. So we can move to Standard 5B, communication with clients and prospective clients. And we've seen this before, this idea of communication. Here we're talking specifically about communicating recommendations and the actions that we are taking or are planning to take or have already taken. But basically what this says is that we're going to have to disclose the basic format and the general principles of the investment processes that we use to analyze investments or form portfolios or whatever it happens to be. Now that's not to say that we have to give our competitors our models, right? So if we've done something that we think gives us some sort of proprietary advantage, well, we don't have to give all the ins and outs, but we do have to be willing to disclose to clients what is the basic format or the general principles that we use to construct portfolios or select securities, whatever it happens to be. So that's a requirement. So we also need to promptly disclose any changes in this process. So if we have been doing something, whatever that happens to be, we've been working on some sort of spread trades, something like that, and we've decided that that is playing out and we want to change direction. Well, if we've been disclosing what we were doing along one path and now we're going to take off on another path, then we have to disclose any material change in what we're doing to our clients. So continuing to look at the standard here, so this is the other 3-slide standard. You'll recall we had one of these back in when we were dealing with standard 3. But nonetheless, this idea of communicating with clients, again, a big deal, so this is not particularly surprising to see the standard take a little longer to get through. We need to use reasonable judgment in identifying which factors are important to investment analysis, recommendations, or actions. So use reasonable judgment in identifying which factors are important. Okay, that's again, boy, that's a hard thing to get your head around in terms of exam preparation. So reasonable judgment, what I would do here is interpret this very broadly. So what should be considered? Well, if you're thinking, should we think about that when we're doing the valuation or not? Then probably you should. So err on the side of deciding something that should be included rather than something that should not be included is the point. Okay? And then, of course, once we determine what these major factors are, we need to include those factors in our communication with our clients or prospective clients in order to make sure that we have good communication, which, of course, is what we are trying to promote here. Okay, so looking at the third and final slide for discussing the standard 5B, we need to distinguish between fact and opinion. Okay, again, a big deal. So it's one thing to say that you believe that sales will grow by 12% next year. It's something else to say that sales will grow by 12% next year. So there's facts and there's opinions, and either of those can be included in a research report. The point is, if you are stating opinions, okay, you have to state them as opinions. So we don't want someone saying that this is going to be the best new product to come out ever, unless they're well, I don't know how that could ever be a fact, but anyway, so if you've got something that you're saying this is going to be an earth-shattering product, okay, well, maybe it should be disclosed that that is the opinion of the analyst or the committee that's writing the report, something along those lines. The important thing is that you are not presenting opinions and portraying them as facts, all right? Clearly communicate potential gains and losses on the investment. This is going to be something this is actually new to the ethics material in the most recent iteration, but clearly communicating potential gains and losses on investment is something that we need to do as an ethical responsibility. So we need to be able to talk about what the potential losses are on a security. So we've got expected returns. Those are easier to calculate. calculating potential gains, potential losses is much more difficult in my estimation, but nonetheless, okay, that is going to be something that should be done under this communication with clients and prospective clients standard 4B. What about some guidance here? Okay, well, include basic characteristics of the security. I will throw your mind back to the notion in standard 3 that sophistication of the client could be considered. So if you're dealing with a very sophisticated client, again, explaining what the difference between a stock and a bond may not be necessary. But that may be necessary if you are dealing with a very unsophisticated client. So we need to inform our client of any changes that are going to occur in our investment process. Always, of course, consider suitability. That's one of my big 3 principles. And remember that suitability is always determined in a portfolio context. So we're going to get to talk a little bit more about that after we get past the code and standards, get into some of the stub material. But the notion that we are not worried about the risk and return of the individual asset, we are worried about the contribution of the individual asset to the risk and return of the portfolio is what matters here. So basically, we're back to the modern portfolio theory idea. And remember, this covers all investment action, not just reports. So any communication that we make is going to be included in this particular process. Okay, so what about recommended procedures? Okay, so we need to make sure that the inclusion or exclusion, or not make sure, but we need to remember that the inclusion or exclusion of information depends on a case-by-case review. So what does that say? Well, when we're presenting a report on an asset, we have to decide, 1, what factors are important, and then 2, who are we presenting that to? So it's going to be necessary on a case-by-case basis to decide what information to include and what information to exclude. Remember that what we need effective communication with the clients. That's going to include, and these are the words we use for performance presentation, but fair, accurate, and complete information, even though that specifically applies to past performance or performance presentation. I think you can use those same terms to describe what's going on here. And finally, of course, if we're going to be making recommendations, and we're going to be communicating those to clients, we need to maintain some records that are going to support those. And, in fact, I have some more to say about maintaining records here in 5C, which deals with record retention. So record retention, I was really glad, this is going back a couple of iterations now in the ethics material, but I was glad when record retention became its own substandards. Here you see it as 5C, because it used to be that at the end of every standard they would have, oh yeah, and keep the records, keep the records, keep the records. So just like you saw in 5B, that's the last thing they say is keep records. Here we see that other places too, but we've kind of jammed most of it into this one thing, so we don't want to talk about record retention the whole time that we're talking about ethics. Well, what does this tell us? Okay, obviously here, if we're dealing with it, we're making investment action, taking investment actions, making recommendations, okay, we are doing that for clients or we are communicating that to clients, well, that's going to be based on some sort of underlying documentation. Okay, well, it's our responsibility to develop and maintain an appropriate records system to support all those analyses that we do, those recommendations that we make, and those types of things, so that when we communicate with clients and prospects, we understand that we have to have an adequate basis supported by research. Okay, we have that, we communicate it to clients. Well, the record retention part reflects our ability to support that in the future if need be. And of course, the notion is that this is going to be good business in the sense of making us perhaps better analysts, but this is also something that protects the analyst so that you can always go back and verify why you said what it was that you said. All right, so what about guidance here? Okay, well, maintain records to support your research and the rationale for what we were doing in terms of the actions we were taking, those types of things. So the records are the firm's property. Okay, so we need to keep that in mind. So this goes back to our responsibilities to employers. What about when we are leaving the employment of a particular employer? Well, we've developed all these records under the auspices of the employer. Well, those records are the firm's property and can't be taken when the member leaves without the firm's consent. Now, the firm tells you to take them. Well, of course, that's a different story. Okay, and if there is no regulatory requirement, so the local laws don't require some sort of holding period, CFAI is recommending a 7-year holding period for those records. Looking at recommended procedures, responsibility to maintain records really falls to the firm rather than the individual analyst. So the idea of record retention is something that should be supported on a firm-wide basis. However, of course, we as individuals working within the firm must comply with that record retention policy. So individuals have to retain the documents to support these investment-related communications, and of course you have to remember that they are going to be, they belong to the firm. Well, what does that mean if you leave? So you're making lots of recommendations, you leave the firm. Well, as you can see here, when member changes firms and they have to support those old recommendations, okay, then they have to recreate the records from either public sources, some combination of public sources, and the new firm's information. So simply relying on memory or the materials from the old firm, they belong to the old firm, they're under no obligation to let you have those or use those to defend yourself in court. In those cases, then you're going to have to recreate them from public sources or from your new firm's resources, and of course that could be, in some cases, a very cumbersome process. And that brings us to the end of Standard 5. So moving on to Standard 6, this is the last of our what I call fundamental standards, that is standards that would apply to anyone, anywhere, but also this represents the caveat to my 3 plus caveat structure. So we had the idea of independence, loyalty, we had reasonable basis due diligence, and then we had suitability. Those are the pillars of the ethics material. And then what happens if we have problems in, say, our independence? Well, we have conflicts of interest, and this is a huge deal on the exam. So this is not a particularly long standard, but it's one that you're going to want to keep in mind, because this is the cure for lots of other problems. So disclosure is going to be something that's really important. So, disclosure of conflicts. Make full and fair disclosure of all matters. Okay, that is a couple of words that you have to be careful in interpreting. Make full, fair disclosure of all matters that could reasonably be expected to impair your independence, objectivity, or interfere generally with your professional activities. The question is, how do you interpret all matters? Well, again, the solution here is to interpret very, very broadly. Okay? I mean, this is one of the most broadly interpreted phrases from the ethics material, at least as it pertains to testing on the CFA exams. So the joke I tell is that if you're doing anything that's more closely related to your professional activities than being the assistant coach on your daughter's soccer team, then that's probably something that needs to be disclosed. So if you get promoted to head coach, that's got to be disclosed. And of course, I'm being facetious with that. But the point is, if you're thinking, should this be disclosed, or does this need to be disclosed or not? Well, then the answer is it does. Okay, so interpret what needs to be disclosed very, very broadly. This was something I was glad to see come into the material when it did, and that is that we have to have disclosures that are prominent and that they are delivered in plain language. So it's not enough to have some sort of obscure footnote on page 27 of the research report that says, the party of the first part with respect to the party of the second part in perpetuity and heretofore, some sort of legalese type stuff. It's got to be prominent, something that people will actually see, and it can't be in legalese. It's got to be plain language so that people can understand it. I'm going to refer to this as effective disclosure. So just having a legal thing in there that says, oh, well, we've disclosed this conflict of interest, that may work in a court of law. Okay? But remember, we're not talking about legalities. We're talking about ethics. And ethics is supposed to be a higher standard. And under the higher standard, we don't need just technical disclosure. We need effective disclosure. So looking at our guidance for this, okay, well, if we're talking about what needs to be disclosed to clients, well, of course, all matters that are going to impact objectivity, and the idea here is to let the client judge our motives and any potential biases. So if the client knows that this potential problem exists, then they can protect themselves, okay, and judge what biases we may bring. A good example is between a member or firm and an issuer. So if the firm or the member has some sort of relationship with a security issuer, well, that needs to be disclosed. Board service, significant consulting relationships, those types of things. Okay, always, and a big deal on the exam is the existence of investment banking relationships. So once again, we're going to analyze this as a member of an equity research team, okay, that is separate from the investment banking division. Well, just remember those dirty investment bankers are always trying to get research reports generated on one way or another so that they can generate more business. So broker-dealer market-making activities, so if you've got market you're making in a security, you've got your own stock of the security, those types of things. Significant stock ownership, board service, all of those are examples of what needs to be disclosed to clients. What about disclosure to employers? So here, looking at employers, well, of course, what's a conflict of interest there? Well, if you have stock ownership, okay, of the stocks that you're following or analyzing, board participation, and anything that would create some sort of pressure. That could be financial pressures or other decision influences, those types of things. All that should be disclosed to your employer. Okay? This also covers conflicts that could be damaging to your employer's business. So if there's something going on that your employer would want to know about, well, again, there's you have to interpret very broadly what it is that needs to be disclosed. Looking at some recommended procedures. So recommended procedures here disclose compensation arrangements with employer that conflict with the client's interest. Okay, of course, it would be better to not have any compensation schemes that conflict with the client's interest. But if for some reason the employer does have a compensation scheme that conflicts with the client's interest, then at a very minimum that needs to be disclosed. So if the firm does not permit disclosure, then what are you going to have to do? Well, I'm being compensated in a way that is not that taints my independence when I'm working with this client. That's just the compensation structure at the firm. The firm refuses to disclose that. Well, that's one of those limiting cases where you may have to quit your job because this ethical dilemma exists. So we don't just because there are negative implications for us personally doesn't mean that we can ignore our ethical responsibilities. Firms are encouraged to include compensation information in promotional materials, and you've seen a lot more of this over the years. At the back of brochures and all, you'll see something about how analysts are compensated, and it comes from this idea of being able of disclosing to clients or to the investing public exactly how the people generating the reports are compensated. Okay, so standard 6B, priority of transactions. Okay, so here's a quick pop test. So if I could blank the screen out, who comes first and who comes last? Okay, well, in all cases, the client comes first, and you, the member, come last. Okay, so we have that. We have the client always coming first, and the member always coming last. So investment transactions for clients and employers must have priority over transactions in which a member or a candidate is a beneficial owner. We need to talk about what that means. Okay, but and you can't use knowledge of impending trades for personal gain. So the classic example of that, of course, would be front running. So what we see when you take the material here is you see that clients are on the top, you're on the bottom, the firm is in the middle. There actually is, and it never gets juxtaposed that I've seen in the material, but there actually is a fourth part of that hierarchy or priority scale. It's going to be clients, then it's going to be capital markets, then it's going to be employer, and then it's going to be you if that ever comes into have any impact on a question. Remember, beneficial owner, this just means direct or indirect personal interest. So I don't know, I answered so many practice questions when I was going through this, but I remember, so I don't know if this was off the exam or a practice question or what, but I remember this one question where a broker was working somewhere. He was, I don't know, let's call it a tech analyst. This is a long, long time ago. Anyway, a tech analyst, And of course, he was doing lots of research, and he knew those firms very well. And his employer, of course, had a restricted list that meant that he couldn't trade on these securities that he was analyzing. But he knew them really well and thought he could trade them better than other people. So he opened up a brokerage account in his wife's name at another shop. Okay, well, obviously, even though he doesn't own the account, he has this beneficial interest in it. He's a beneficial or an indirect owner. And of course, that was going to be something outside the code of ethics. Why? Remember, his intent there was to circumvent. So we're not worried about the legalities, we're worried about intent. So client-employer transactions take priority over personal transactions. We've said that a number of times. Here's a great caveat down at the bottom. So I remember another question where there was somebody who had lots of different clients. One of the clients was for Aunt Ruth. Okay? And so this portfolio manager had 20 clients. One of them was Aunt Ruth. And in order to avoid the appearance of evil, he always traded for Aunt Ruth last. Okay, well, you know, that makes some sort of sense, right? We're trading for Aunt Ruth last because we want to avoid even appearing to be have any favoritism towards Aunt Ruth. What's the problem with that? Well, the problem with that is we are disadvantaging one of our clients. So if it's a family member account, then it's a client account, and it has to be treated like all other accounts. So it is true that you can't treat them better, but you also can't treat them worse. Family accounts are still accounts, so we've got to keep that in mind when we do this. Okay, so recommended procedures here. So the firm's compliance procedures should limit participation in equity IPOs. So we all know about the underpricing thing there. So if we have shares in an IPO, well, we probably want to keep those out of the hands of the individuals. Those should go into the clients' portfolios. We're going to see later that we ought to think carefully about how we allocate those. And we ought to restrict repurchase of securities through private placement because of exactly the same reasons. So not much that would be surprising there. Continuing on with recommended procedures, we ought to have blackout or restricted periods. So when we can't trade on particular securities because we're in possession of sensitive information or whatever it happens to be, we ought to establish reporting procedures and prior clearance requirements. So if you're a tech analyst and you're buying or selling tech firms, okay, that might be permissible as long as you receive prior clearance to do that. So some sort of reporting procedures, some sort of prior clearance stuff. And then disclose policies on personal investing to clients upon request. That's another one of those things that I want to call and request sometime just to see how long it takes them to find that and send it to me. Because my suspicion is that while most firms have a policy on personal investing and they have a policy of making it available, that no one ever asks for it. And if you talk to whoever answers the phone, they probably won't be able to tell you much about it. All right? Okay, so to finish this out, let's look at 6C, referral fees. This has to do with either paying a referral fee, so someone's referring a client to us, or receiving a referral fee when we refer our clients to someone else. So I'm a portfolio manager. Again, I'll use the example of dealing with personal finance, but I am a portfolio manager working with someone, helping them invest their nest egg. Maybe this is a high net worth client, and I see that they're going to need some sort of insurance products, so I refer them to a colleague, and for that referral, or in exchange for it, I receive some compensation. That's a referral fee. Well, that has to be disclosed to the employer and to the clients and prospective clients, okay, regardless of what kind of compensation or consideration it is. So if we're receiving it from someone else or we're paying it to someone else, okay, then we have to disclose all these referral fees to clients or prospective clients and to employers. So what about some guidance here? Hey, well, guidance, we need to, the disclosure is, the idea here is that the disclosure allows the clients and employers to evaluate the full cost of service and any potential biases. So if I refer somebody to a particular insurance brokerage, well, did I refer them there because they are the best at what they do, or is it because I receive a referral fee? So this at least gives the client the heads up to be able to say, well, there may be a bias there, and if so, they can evaluate that and have a fair shot at doing so. Disclosures to be made prior to entering into any formal agreements. So if we're going to have a formal relationship, we have to disclose that in advance. Okay? And, of course, the nature of the compensation. Is this cash compensation, or is it something else that we ought to be looking at? Looking at a little more guidance here. So again, looking for referral fee guidance, okay, we need to encourage firms to have a clear policy regarding referral compensation. Are we going to do it? Under what circumstances? Those types of things. Firms that do not prohibit should have an approval process. So many firms simply prohibit this practice because it is fraught with ethical problems, but if they're not going to prohibit it, they ought to have some sort of process that you go through when you disclose that when potential referral process is disclosed to them, how to evaluate it and clear it and get it approved and all those types of things. And members should update referral compensation disclosure to the employer at least quarterly, which I would have thought they would have said yearly, but of course this goes back to my idea that maybe there was an extra employer on that committee that put this stuff together. So they want quarterly disclosure of this referral fee stuff. So that is Standard 6, and that is the end of what I would interpret as the fundamental requirements associated with the ethics material. So that is the notion here is that Standards 1 through 6 would apply to anyone who wanted to be an ethical provider of professional services in our industry. Standard 7, this is the responsibility of CFA Institute members and CFA candidates. If you haven't also joined the CFAI yet, you are a candidate, then you've taken upon yourself not only the basic or fundamental ethical responsibilities, but also the additional requirements that come here in Standard 7. So first of all, conduct as a member and as members and candidates in the CFA program. What does this say? Well, we can't engage in any conduct that compromises the reputation or integrity of the institute of the designation or the integrity, validity, or security of the CFA examinations. So surprise, surprise, it would be unethical to cheat on an exam. So here we are under guidance. So what does this include? Cheating on an exam. Obviously, that's going to be unethical. Okay, disregarding the rules and policies or security measures related to an exam administration. Now, what does this mean? What you'll see, and of course you've already been through the level 1 exam, so you've kind of got a handle on this, but there is a whole list of things that you can't bring into an exam, right? There's a list of things you can bring in. It's like a pencil and you can wear a watch or something like that. But then there's this whole long list about all these other things and all this exam security stuff. Even if you were not cheating, your intent was not to defraud or to get any advantage, okay, but you're disregarding the rules, okay, then that's going to be an ethical breach, and if it gets reported to a proctor, they're going to invoke this clause, and even if you got a passing score on this difficult level 2 exam, they are going to revoke that, or rescind that score. So make sure that you're going to be in compliance, both with the big picture, you're not cheating, and with the technical stuff that's going to go on with respect to exam security and that sort of stuff. Also, giving confidential information to candidates or the public. Okay, well, confidential information is essentially being interpreted now as anything on the exam. So some more guidance here. We're not supposed to disclose formulas tested or not tested, so you can't tell your friends, hey, the Black-Scholes formula wasn't on the exam. Okay, by the way, the Black-Scholes formula won't be on the exam because the LOS says it won't be on the exam, but nonetheless, you can't talk about specific formulas, specific question information, topic emphasis, or other exam topics tested. There's lots of information that floats around about a question, and in general terms, I think that's probably still okay, but you can't talk about, why this, there was so much of this stuff on there, and, this question dealt with, some specifics of, I don't know what it would be, some sort of binomial interest rate model twist or something along those lines. So anyway, you have to be very careful in talking about the exam under this material. So if I can get my slide to go forward here. We'll see a little more guidance. Okay, so again, this conduct includes, so now we're going to look at, still looking at conduct as members and candidates. Okay, this is going to include improper use of the CFA designation to further your personal and professional objectives. Well, aren't you getting the CFA charter in order to further your personal and professional objectives? Well, you are. What we're talking about here is improper use, and we'll see as we go through that that's going to be interpreted as misrepresenting what that means. So misrepresenting the CFA Institute or the Professional Development Program or the Professional Conduct Statement. So every year when I renew my membership, I've got to sign a professional conduct statement that says basically I'm still a good person, I haven't been lying, cheating, or stealing. Okay, there's also a professional development program, which is basically the CFA charter holders' voluntary continuing education program. So most years I more than meet what the requirements of that are, but I always have to go back and think about, well, have I done enough in ethics and all this sort of stuff in order to say that I have. If I haven't, that's okay. It's not required. Now, the professional conduct statement is required, okay, but the professional development program is not. But in either case, you can't misrepresent what's going on there. Okay, so what about Standard 7B, reference to the institute, the designation, and the program? Well, when referring to the CFA Institute membership, designation, or candidacy, you cannot misrepresent or exaggerate the meaning or the implication of whatever it is you're referencing. So you can always make factual statements. Okay, I am a CFA charter holder. You know, I finished my CFA in whatever year. You can say that this was a rigorous set of exams. Okay, but you can't imply that, or you can't insinuate that this means you're going to be able to beat the market where other people can't, or that you are better looking or sexier or whatever it happens to be. So, the membership here in terms of what is required to maintain membership. Okay, well, one, we have to complete this PCS, Professional Conduct Statement, every year, and not surprisingly, CFAI seems to be particularly interested in me paying my dues every year. So if I have to do those, I do those two things every year. If I do, then I can continue to use the CFA designation. If I don't, my membership goes on inactive status, and I think that means that I'm not supposed to use the CFA designation on my business cards and on my letterhead. Okay, so what is using the CFA designation? We're talking about the marks here, Charter Financial Analyst or CFA. Okay, you can't misrepresent what it means. You can't exaggerate it. You can't talk about what it means to hold the CFA in some light that it does not actually possess. So again, you can't say, well, this means that I'm the smartest person that ever lived, even though I'm sure you are, but you can't say that because you have the CFA designation. Some more guidance here. Okay, candidates can reference participation in the program, but you cannot imply achievement of any partial designation. So when you finish and you get your email saying that you have passed this difficult level 2 exam, what you can't do is say that you're a level 2 CFA. You can say that you have passed the CFA Level 2 exam. That's a factual statement. Once you register for Level 3, you can say that you are a Level 3 candidate, okay, but there's no partial designation there. You can also, if you are a 3-up, 3-down type person, okay, you can say I passed all levels on the first attempt. That is a factual statement, but it does not. It would be a much further leap to say that that implies superior ability. In fact, I passed all the exams on the first attempt, so obviously that doesn't mean superior ability. So anyway, so what about using the marks here on your business card? Okay, well the point here is that you can use them after your name, so Andrew Holmes CFA or Andrew Holmes Chartered Financial Analyst. Okay, but other than that, you essentially have to use them as adjectives and not as nouns. Now, as we've gone through this material, I have been very careful, given that I was making these videos, to always talk about a CFA charter holder. So I'm using the terms or the mark CFA as an adjective, not as a noun. So I don't talk about being a CFA, you're a CFA charter holder. Now, in the real world, I get sloppy about that, but I think I've been careful on this video. Go back and listen to it one more time and see if I messed up anywhere. If I did, then send someone a Schweizer an email and tell them that I was used it as a noun and not an adjective. I'm just kidding. Anyway, so what is the last thing here? Well, this is the slide we've been looking for in terms of the code and standards. Since this is the last one, it's all over. So what is it we're supposed to do here? We're supposed to make sure that our employer is aware of proper references to the CFA designation and CFA candidacy. So we're responsible for how we use it. We are also responsible for at least educating our employer about the appropriate response. And that completes, at long last, the code and standards. This is somewhat arduous, and it took a long time to get through it, but remember, this is where the rubber hits the road. Still have some more material to cover, very testable. In fact, I think there will be a fair number of questions that come out of that material, but you can't really understand the stub material until you have this down. So I think that this is a very important part of putting together a good score on the ethics material.